Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day to join us to talk a little bit about what does the C-suite really want from HR and L&D. My name is Joe Lavigny. I'm a Director of Training and Development here at Capson Management Simulations. And a little bit about myself, I work with a lot of organizations on training and development programs specifically geared around the use of business simulations to develop business acumen, I guess you could say, strategic thinking, collaboration among teams. But most of our training programs are geared around the business side of things. And we hear a lot from organizations that we work with about HR's role, and most of the time on a daily basis when I'm talking with clients, it's someone within the HR function that I'm dealing with. It could be on the HR side or the training side. And the way I view myself is kind of a, I guess, if you will. I like to steal ideas from others as a pirate would steal their treasure. And I like to hear others' treasures. And then I like to share them with my fellow pirates, and I consider all my HR and training friends to be pirates out there. So today what we're going to do is share with you some of the things we've heard at conferences that we've been to and listened to some senior level speakers talk about HR and the business impacts, as well as some recent articles that we've read. So what we're going to cover today is this conference point of view from thought leaders on HR's impact on the business. This next part, this 8 articles on how HR can make a shift to impact business results, has to be one of the best articles I've read in a couple years now on HR and business results. And I think you'll find it very interesting as we go through this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, at the very end, some tools you can use as an HR or L&D professional to really make a business impact. Before we get started, I thought it would be helpful to share a little bit about who is Capson. I already mentioned the training program side of things that I work on, but Capson has been around actually since 1985, and we are a leader in business simulation and business training events. We really have a strong focus on the academic market. We're used by over 100,000 students a year in classrooms, and that's spread out through about 900 universities worldwide. On my side of the business, as I mentioned, I work with corporate training programs to design and develop these programs to really help impact business side of things, leadership, strategy, finance, for all different backgrounds and functions within a business. We do talk to a lot of C-suite leaders, whether they be CFOs, CEOs, or VPs and very senior level folks, and they constantly are telling us about HR and L&D, you know, that they're a big force out there and a big part of the business, and what they're really looking for and how they're hoping it can impact the business results at an organization. And we do also deliver a lot of programs that are geared specifically toward the HR and L&D professionals, and really to help develop their business acumen. So we get to hear a lot when we meet with the HR and L&D crowd at even some of our programs about some of the skills that they're hoping to gain, how they think they could use some of these skills and programs, you know, to basically help impact the business back at their organization. You know, we hear a lot about HR getting a seat at the table, and I think we're really past that point now where HR has really gotten a seat at the table. The key is now that you have that seat, what do you do with it? What information can you provide to those numbers guys and those business folks out there that really, you know, can show that, all right, you deserved and earned the seat at the table and we should really listen to you. Someone comes to mind that I saw a video, it was a short video recently. Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, also the founder of the Jack Welch School of Management. He put out a short video recently about HR's impact and role of business, and 2 things he said just really struck me. One of the things he mentioned was that basically, you know, HR had always been looked at as picnics and payroll, or payroll and picnics, and they're not really that. They actually could be the strongest function of an organization. So let's dive into this a little bit and take a look. These are some of the clients we've worked with, and you can see some names up there, GE and several others that we've worked with in the past. And we have worked alongside Jack Welch when he was the CEO of GE. So recently, back in September, I attended the Human Capital Institute Learning and Leadership Conference. And I want to do my pirating as best as I can and really share some of the treasures that I found at this Learning and Leadership Conference. So there's 4 specific speakers that were there that I really enjoyed listening to as they really talked about impacting the organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about today these 4 senior level folks that maybe on the HR side. You can see Gary Ridge, the president and CEO of WD-40, we're going to share some of his information with you. I think you'll find it interesting as to the different ways that HR and L&D can impact these organizations. So let's jump in and let's talk a little bit about Gary Ridge's presentation from the HCI Learning and Leadership Conference. Gary Ridge was one of the most entertaining speakers, especially for a CEO that I've ever encountered. He's an Australian guy, works at a company that sells lubricants out of San Diego, and just an excellent stage presence. And one of his biggest things was that, hey, your company and your company's results are really all about the people. So what he started off telling us was that the reason to be is something you should think about. This really goes to a lot of you have heard of Simon Sinek, and he says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And you may have seen one of a famous TED Talk by Simon Sinek about the why, the how, and the what. That if you can express why you do what you do, you can then express how you do it, and then you could tell people what it is you do, that's your reason to be, those 3 things, the why, the how, and the what of your company. Gary moved a little bit further on talking about the WD-40 values, and basically what he said was that, hey, when we interview people, I don't necessarily care that we look at their exact resume. He said, we're not looking for someone that has the perfect educational background. What I'm looking for is the values that they live by, and do they match our values here at WD-40? And he went through a lot of the values that they look for, but what he said was that if people have the same values, they bring passion and they work harder together and they're more productive because they trust each other and they believe in each other. This was an outstanding statement. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Boy, you talk to a VP of strategy at your company and you tell him this, he's going to fall off of his chair ready to come back at you on this. But if you really think about it, strategy is all up at that top level, that big umbrella of an organization. What makes up that strategy and how it's executed are the people. And in order for those people to really execute that strategy, they have to have a collective shared set of beliefs, a shared set of values, attitudes, and those resulting behaviors will basically help your workforce. Your company's culture has a significant effect on the success of your business, and according to Gary Ridge, a significant success and impact on the bottom line of a company. So Gary went on to tell us about the culture at WD-40, and what he said is that we don't call ourselves a team, we're a tribe. And he went on to explain what he meant by a tribe. And first he told us that, yes, being a tribe, I do have a teepee. There is a giant teepee at the WD-40 home headquarters. They have meetings in the teepee, and sometimes he runs down the hall at WD-40 wearing a headdress. So a little bit about this tribal culture that Gary talks about. Well, it's based around certain things. A tribal culture incorporates learning and teaching. So very interesting on that it's learning and teaching, not just teaching and not just learning, but what they believe in is that everybody needs to learn and everybody needs to share and teach what they've learned. They believe strongly at WD-40 in succession and innovation. When we talk about succession, is there a succession plan for all the employees? Do they know where they're going and where they could go? Are they involved in that succession plan? Those individuals that have the same values and attitudes and leading those behaviors are often driving the innovation at an organization. He then talks about ceremony and celebration. They celebrate everything. They celebrate wins at WD-40, and they celebrate and have ceremonies for these types of things. We're looking at, he's also talking in a tribal culture about specialized skills. Everyone should have some sort of specialized skills, and then they share those specialized skills with one another. Knowing who to talk to at an organization is very important, and at WD-40 it's crucial. Who has the specialized skills that we can lean on? If you think about a tribal culture, there's hunters, there's gatherers, there's those that cook, there's those that do certain activities that make the clothes for them. Whatever it may be in a tribal culture, they all have a specialized skill, but they all have to work together, and that really fits in with that cross-functional collaboration side of things that we talk about often. He then mentioned a tribal culture is filled with warriors. Well, these aren't always the people that are on the front lines fighting the wars or the battles that are out there. Everyone in a tribe is a warrior. Everyone is fighting tooth and nail to achieve the common goal of the organization. A tribal culture definitely has a sense of community and belonging. And then finally, he talked about values, that every organization should have values. And again, this goes right back to what I mentioned about living the WD-40 values, that if you have employees that you can find that truly believe in your values at your organization, they're going to come in and make a huge impact, as they'll have the passion for your organization and they believe in what you're trying to achieve there. One of the other points that Gary mentioned during his presentation was about the learning moment. So it was interesting. We hear a lot of organizations that say, hey, there was a mistake made. There was an issue that came, someone was at fault. They don't look at it that way at WD-40. Gary Ridge looks at this and he says, hey, this was a learning moment. It wasn't a mistake. It happened for a reason. And it's a learning moment if we can all sit back and say, okay, what happened and why did it happen and how can we prevent it from happening in the future? And no one is to blame. So now that doesn't mean that Gary, I mean, he informed us that, hey, if a mistake keeps happening over and over, then there's definitely a problem that we need to figure out. But typically when there is a mistake, they don't look at it that way. It's definitely portrayed as that learning moment kind of thing. So if we sit and think for a minute about all the areas in Gary's presentation being all about the people, how much does HR have an impact on these areas that Gary talked about? Well, HR can spread throughout the organization, the why, the how, and the what about what we do. When hiring employees, share the values of the organization that you're within and make sure that those folks that you hire and bring on board have those same types of values. Behaviors is a big one if you think about that. What can you do as an HR L&D person to help in resulting behaviors? And I think a lot of this falls on the training side of things. If we can think back to the Kirkpatrick model of levels and engagement at a lowest level, moving up to knowledge, but then moving up to knowledge actually changing a behavior at an organization. And we know, according to Kirkpatrick, that if you can change a behavior, you can actually impact the business and have strong business results and outcomes. So Gary was very proud to tell us something that, hey, engagement at that lowest level of Kirkpatrick, but engagement brought on by passion of employees, by their beliefs, their values, that equals productive employees. Productivity equals business results. And he wanted to share with us his 5-year stock results attributed to living the values and culture. And he said this, that I believe the results of our stock increase over the last 5 years are specifically attributed to the living of values and cultures by each and every one of our employees. So what I've got on the screen for you is the 5-year stock results of WD-40. What company wouldn't like to have stock growth like that over a 5-year period. That's amazing. It's a nice steady incline going up. Sure, a couple hiccups here and there, but look at those business results. Investors out there want to invest in this company, and the CEO of this organization believes it specifically because of the people, the engagement, the values that they believe, and the culture that they work within. Again, HR has one of the biggest impacts on culture and values. The next speaker at HCI that I want to talk about was a gentleman named David Foreman. He's actually the Chief Learning Officer at the Human Capital Institute, and he's the author of a book called Fearless HR. If anybody gets a chance to pick up this book, there is a lot of good treasures that you can find within this book, but he gave us some nice highlights, and I'd like to share some of these highlights with you as well, because it really is focusing on driving the business results. Of course, to start off, he had to tell us kind of the evolution of HR. We know years ago that HR was all about being polite and everyone should get along. We can admit that, right? And then they moved on to being the police. Make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do and no one's doing things they're not supposed to do. Then suddenly they started to shift into this role of partner. That's when we first started hearing that saying that, HR needs a seat at the table. That's when the partner really came in, and we started seeing job titles in HR like human resource business partner. That really started to shift that focus. But then what he said is that we need to get it all the way over to not just being a partner, but we need to be a player. We need to get HR to be a business player within this. What he also mentioned was that companies with high levels of engagement increased operating income by 19%. Companies with low engagement saw decreases of 33%. Now, operating income is a key success measure that organizations like General Electric, Merck, you name it, they're looking at operating income. If you can show that you help with engagement, that engagement then increases operating income, you're bringing valid numbers to the CFO or whoever it is that may be looking at that and showing how you're really impacting engagement, which is impacting operating income. That's a success measure, a business result. 20% of business success can be attributed to effective HR professionals. 80% of a company's value is based on unrecognized intangible assets, brand, quality of customers and suppliers, intellectual capital, internal processes. Basically what they're saying here is that, hey, on that balance sheet, you don't see this stuff, that the value of the company is really in the people itself. People costs often comprise more than 50% of all the costs in an organization. And HR has an impact on basically all that 50% of those costs. If we take a look at where he talked about HR in the past, that's what you see on the screen right now in orange. HR was always known as this reactive group, order taking, people focused, tactician, local, working locally, problem finding, staff support, retention. But look at where the shift has gone now that HR has moved from that police and politeness over to partner and even player. HR is definitely more proactive nowadays. They're planning. They're business focused as opposed to people focused. But each one of you that's on this call today, that if we forget about the people and become too business focused, we lose that engagement. We lose that value. So what he suggested during his presentation was, yes, be business focused when you need to be and when you need to share the results and make the results happen, but don't forget to be people focused as you move through this. If we take a look, what we have here is, again, the perceptions of HR, adds no business value, too siloed and inwardly focused, a weak discipline with poor tools. This is some of the old perceptions of HR, but look at those opportunities in the middle. Building HR's capability, strengthening professional networks and communities. This is that partnership side of things that was fought for and achieved by so many HR professionals out there. Implementing the right HR levels. We're going to talk more about some of the right HR levers that you can achieve. And then moving forward to business results, well, basically you're looking at improving business results through better alignment, through cost savings, through productivity improvements, being a trusted and effective business leader opposed to just being a perception of what HR was. If we look at the impact of HR competencies on strategic role effectiveness, what was found is that 21% of the competencies, if you can achieve business acumen, you can have a huge impact on HR competencies, or excuse me, on strategic role effectiveness. 13% on workforce planning, 11% tied with engagement strategies and succession management, 7% tie for performance management and retention strategies. And if we think about this as HR professionals and L&D professionals out there, a lot of us focus on that bottom 7% or the 11% there. Build that business acumen. It can really help having an effect on a strategy at an organization and really solidifying the seat at the table that you've earned up to this point. David talked a lot about a business acumen IQ, or what he called the business acumen Q, because these are questions that you should ask yourself on the HR or L&D function side of things. What he talked about was, is L&D's agenda the business agenda? When anyone comes to you and says, we need training, we need this to happen in our organization, ask them why. What do you want to achieve by that? Think about the Kirkpatrick model. What is the business outcome of doing that? What are revenue and cost trends over the past 3 to 5 years? How many of us on the HR side have thought about revenue and cost trends over the past 3 to 5 years? What percentage of market value is comprised of intangibles? What is revenue per employee? We're going to talk more about this calculation in a little bit. But it's nice to bring it up here because it shows that there's a variety of people at different levels talking about revenue per employee. And then he takes it a step further. How does this revenue per employee compare with the 3 top competitors that are out there? The last one on there is interesting. Do you have a financial buddy? It's always good, and when we're hearing a lot and seeing a lot of articles lately about people talking about having a financial buddy. Getting closer to the CFO, getting closer to someone in the finance department. And if you can speak their language, and we're going to talk more about speaking their language in a little bit, if you can speak their language, you can gain that financial buddy. And it's important to have, but do you have one right now? David talked about using a SWOT analysis. This is something that's often done on the marketing side of things, looking at strengths and weaknesses, looking at opportunities and threats, but how many HR professionals have actually done a SWOT analysis? What are the strengths of our company? And those are typically the internal factors. So what are our strengths? Well, maybe it's cash flow, and he put a few up here as examples. Maybe it's our employee skills. Maybe it's that we have a global presence. Those could be strengths. What are the weaknesses that we have as an internal factor? Well, maybe it's that our new products aren't that great. Maybe it's we don't have that innovative of leadership, or we have a complacent culture. Whatever that may be, dig deep and think about what are the weaknesses at the organization. If we look at external factors, then look outside the organization. What opportunities does our organization have, and how can HR impact those? And then also look at the threats. Threats are not just based on stealing your market share or stealing your sales. What about stealing your employees? What are you doing to look at avoiding threats from other companies coming in and actually taking good, strong, solid employees away? Meaningful outcome measure. This is difficult to see, but I pulled it right from David's presentation, because what he does is an outcome. He says, all right, if we're going to focus on innovation, what are the measures that we're going to look at, and how can we impact them, and how important are they? So if we took a look at innovation, what are the number of new products that we've had, the number of new patents, the number of sales from new products, and then how can that be translated to something that we do in HR? Maybe it's getting people to think with a more innovative mindset. And you can move down this list to things like quality, customer loyalty and satisfaction, Customer surveys to improve that loyalty, to understand what your customers really want. Doing that survey and then getting the results out there so you can measure those results and determine, is there training that's needed to help improve our customer loyalty and satisfaction. Competitive differentiation, strategic accomplishment, cost savings. These are all areas that if you really think about, HR can have a significant impact on. So what he says is list the outcome, say the specific measure, and then figure out how important those are, and then focus on which ones are most important and work your way down the list. The steps to take. Well, David tells us that basically breaking down capabilities and competencies into key performance indicators. How many of us really look at key performance indicators on the HR and L&D side? And we're going to talk about some really good key performance indicators when we get to our article shortly. But think about, what are the organization's key performance indicators that you may see? Are they things like sales, revenue, profitability? Are they things like market share? Are they things like stock price, like at WD-40? Well, they talked about engagement and values drive stock price. Think about that as you go through this. What are the key performance indicators, and how do your department's key performance indicators affect the overall company's key performance indicators? Develop an assessment instrument and gather diverse data on your own strengths and weaknesses. We just talked about that SWOT analysis. And what he says is use that outcome sheet that we just showed you to pick 2 or 3 areas. Look for the ones that are most important and work on those. You can't possibly address all 12 or 13 of those things that he had on the list on the previous page. Hit a couple at a time. Get those working. Get those moving in the right direction, and then move on to the next level of importance. Develop and commit to a 6 to 8 month development plan. Assessing the actual progress. This is something on the HR and L&D side that we forget to do, is assessing the progress. We always talk about return on investment and how can we measure that, but what about just comparing this year to last year on certain areas like engagement numbers or whatever those may be, and we'll talk about more of those coming up. But are we making progress from this year to last year? All the other departments within an organization have to typically show progress, sales growth over last year, cost savings over last year. But how often does HR say, well, this is the progress we've made on our engagement survey since last year? The next speaker that we're going to talk about is Klaus Hovelts, and Klaus was interesting. So he was the director of corporate learning at a company called SimCorp, and what he basically talked to us about was continuous learning enabling a competitive advantage. Now, when we do strategy and business programs, we talk a ton about competitive advantage and how can you gain competitive advantage. Well, Klaus basically tied into this continuous learning model that they have in developing their employees, and how the employees themselves gain the organization a competitive advantage. So basically what he looked at was, what he showed us was completing a complete overview of skills and knowledge for each job role that are linked to the strategy. Now this is tough. You're at a large organization and you're telling me that you want me to go and find each job role and tell me how the skills and knowledge for that job role are linked to the company's strategy. How the heck can you do that or spend time doing that? Well, you have to tackle it a little bit at a time, but we're going to talk a little bit about Klaus's model here. And what he basically says is that, hey, you have the overall strategy at the top of the page. You know what that your company's strategy is. What's the department strategy? So now we're going to break it down and we're going to say, okay, we're going to tackle one department at a time. Maybe it's IT. Maybe it's the marketing department. Maybe it's the sales department. We're going to tackle that department. Well, what is that department's strategy, and what are the KPIs for that department, those key performance indicators that department is trying to achieve? And then he says, well, wait a second. If we're trying to achieve these, what behaviors have to change amongst our employees so that they can achieve these KPIs? And then what skills and knowledge do they need to change those behaviors? Now, was this information that Klaus shared with us groundbreaking, earth-shattering information? No, it should look familiar to some of you out there. It should look familiar as it's the Kirkpatrick model. He's basically saying that, hey, start with the skills and the knowledge. That skill and knowledge changes behavior. The behavior leads to business results, and the business results should match up with the overall strategy of the organization. Claus also believes heavily in the 70-20-10 model, as we do here at Capsum. We believe in learning by doing, but he has a little different approach to this. The development plan for each employee is based around the 70-20-10 model. 70% of their development should be through what they call living it. That's doing it. 20% is based on leading it. Well, in the 70-20-10 model, we're talking here about mentoring, right? And coaching others. So they just changed it to 20% through leading. And then the final was 10% through learning. In the 70-20, that 10% is what we call classroom, right? The classroom side of things. 10% is through learning. So what he's done is combine the Kirkpatrick model and the 70-20-10 model that a lot of us on the L&D side have heard about, and he's made this into an individual development plan. They then have development talks. These are safe environment talks with their employees where they can talk about their succession and their development in the future of an organization. And then one of the advantages SimCorp had that maybe some of us don't is they had a supporting IT system for this training where they could actually develop a page and a screen that looks very easy to use, I guess you could say. If we summarize Claus's information, is basically what he's saying is a profound understanding of responsibility and importance. The managers have an obligation to develop their teams. High performers challenge the status quo through continuous learning. So we do this by setting up these competency profiles. And it was an elaborate page that he showed us, but basically it was, hey, there was a set of skills, and their IT system had developed links that if you had an area for need or development of a certain skill, you could click a tab, it would take you to a course that you could run. Above that on the page was the behavioral side of things. And that was often through performance reviews, maybe through 360s, and things that you could work on there. And there was a link that the IT department had set up for how they could work on these behavioral skills. On the right side of every employee's competency profile was the development plan, the 70-20-10. How are you going to develop by living this, by leading it, and by learning it? And then again, he talked about those EPR development talks. It was a safe setting, and that was what he stressed to us, was that, hey, this is a safe setting to talk about your career aspirations. You shouldn't be scared to say, hey, you know what, I want to move to another department in my organization. I want to be able to grow in my organization without fear of repercussions from your current manager saying, well, I don't want you to leave here. So it's a safe setting to talk about that. It's a candid and open discussion about development and potential. And then obviously the advantage I mentioned was the supporting IT. What he said is that 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 equals a competitive advantage for your organization and makes your organization stronger. And if we think about every part of this level that HR can impact, the level 1 on here, the competency profiles, and the development talks, how you're helping your company gain a competitive advantage. The last speaker that we're going to talk about for the HCI group was Hal Gregerson. He's the executive director of the MIT Leadership Center, and he had some interesting things to say about what he called the leadership dilemma and asking tough questions before someone else does. Now, I thought he was going to go into just saying, hey, leaders should be running around asking this specific question and that specific question. That is not at all where he went with this. What he said was, hey, leaders need to admit that you don't know what you don't know. And he said it's okay. He gave us example after example of leaders, CEOs of organizations that say, I don't know. I just don't know. But what question should I ask to find out? And who should I ask that question to? That's the dilemma leaders have. But how many of us know leaders and have done leadership development programs where we can't get leaders to admit that they don't know? He then gave us 3 things to be more of. And what he said was, be more wrong. Every day, your leaders should wake up thinking about how many things are they dead wrong about? Be more uncomfortable. How do you put yourself in a position to ask the right questions? Well, what he's saying there is it's uncomfortable for a leader to say, I don't know, but what questions should I ask to that? And finding the right questions that you should ask, but being uncomfortable about saying, you know what, I don't know. And it was very interesting because Hal was one of the speakers that talked, I think it was on the second day in the afternoon. And on the first day, we had Gary Ridge talk from WD-40 that we listened to, and one of his points that he did mention was that he likes to walk around and say, you know what, I don't know. I'm not really sure. And there was a couple other speakers that mentioned the fact that they do like to say, I don't know. They admit that they don't know everything. So what they do is they ask questions. And then there were several videos that Hal played for us of CEOs saying, you know what, my biggest strength is that I can be more quiet. I listen to learn. I'll ask the question. I'll find out the question that I need to ask. I'll ask that question, and then I just sit back and listen. And I let my employees, I let my trusted group tell me what they think and what they believe. So he gave us this idea of something called the question burst. We've all heard of brainstorming sessions, right? We have a problem. Let's all get to the whiteboard and let's brainstorm these answers to what we could do. That's not what Hal said to do. Hal said, hey, brainstorm questions. What questions should we be asking? Sit in a room with everyone. No one is allowed to give a single answer. Everyone is just supposed to ask questions. Write the questions down, and then as a group, sit down and say which of these questions is going to get us to the answer that we need to. So brainstorming questions, and he called it a question burst. So I promised you earlier to share some information from an article that I read, and this article was by Dr. John Sullivan. It was just published September 22nd in the TLNT or Talent website and in their publication. The title is great. Here's what HR must do to have the business impact that CEOs want. So we've got our seat at the table, right? And the CEO's making sure that, hey, you're giving me the impact I want, just like he is with everybody else that's sitting at that table now. So what I want to go through is the impacts that he actually talked about here. If we look at the 8 impacts, we'll start with number 1, accept accountability for improving people management results. So CEOs want to see their HR and their L&D team accept accountability for improving people management results. Number 2, demand a shift to data-based decision making. Everyone else is talking about big data and data-based decision making. Why shouldn't HR look at data-based decision making all important management and people management decisions data? That includes using data to identify the most effective hiring criteria, to identify the factors that cause employee turnover, and using data to identify the barriers that decrease productivity and innovation. Use the data that's available to you. Examples of data-based decision making, they might focus on performance management. Performance management may be tracking metrics, like how long it takes to improve a D player to an A player. How much does it cost to improve a D player to an A player? And what percentage of these D players ever even become A players? And then you could determine, is it worth investing the money in a D player to an A player or not? But using the data that you have to come up with these metrics. Dr. Sullivan even suggested the possibility of predictive metrics. And that's something you might want to think about. If you get a chance to read his article, you can hear a little bit further about this, but what predictive measurements would we have on the HR side of things? Well, if you can come up with predictive measurements, you can basically help recommend prescriptive actions so that managers will know how to solve problems when they occur. Measuring and increasing workforce productivity. So even though measuring and reporting on productivity of the workforce seems like a basic task, how many of us actually go ahead and do that and actually measure increased workforce productivity? making managers more accountable for great people management. So yeah, we made you a manager, right? But how many of us hold those managers accountable for the people management side? We hold them accountable for their numbers and hitting their metrics or their goals of their department, but how often do we hold them accountable for being great people managers? Because we know if people are feeling like they're managed appropriately, they're more engaged and more productive. And knowing from our talks that we shared earlier, the more engaged, the more productive you can be, hey, you're helping gaining competitive advantage. And here we go, Dr. Sullivan talking about building a competitive advantage. Almost every product business unit or process views itself as operating in this competitive environment. But what is HR doing to establish that competitive advantage? Well, we just showed you some information from our last speaker that we shared information on as to how HR is actually helping to build a true competitive advantage. Expecting and reporting on continuous improvement, measuring quality and error rates in people and time management, and then finally calculating your ROI. So I'm going to dive into a couple of these a little bit deeper for you. Measuring and increasing workforce productivity. Well, the most widely accepted measure of talent management effectiveness is known as workforce productivity, which is revealed by the average revenue per employee. So the two key components you need for this calculation are revenue and the number of employees. Another more powerful but harder to calculate indication of workforce productivity is revenue per labor dollar spent. So these are two great calculations and ratios that you can come up with to measure workforce productivity, and we've already talked earlier about ways that you can improve productivity through engagement. So what you've done is you're translating engagement to productivity and showing ratio, and then you could show growth in that ratio year over year over year. And now you're giving results just like other departments have to do. This calculation of more difficult calculation is basically dividing your total labor costs into the company's revenue. We're going to look at point number 5, building the competitive advantage, a little bit further. We talked about this in our last presentation from our last speaker, but what he says, Dr. Sullivan, about building a competitive advantage is under this new business-focused approach, talent management would be required to monitor the talent results and the approaches of major talent competitor. How often do we look at what our competitors are doing with their talent, and are we ensuring that what we do in our organization, what we do in talent, is better in every important area than what they do, than what our competitors do? So we often look internally, but if we remember that SWOT analysis that I talked about earlier, what is the competition doing? What opportunities do we have to get better than them? And what are our threats against our competition? Well, when we look at HR as in the talent side of things, in those important areas, what are we doing right and what could we do better? And what can we do better than they do? Let's look at number 6, reporting on continuous improvement. Now, I've made some suggestions in the last 30, 40 minutes or so on continuous improvement, but we think about it, all other departments are expected to show continuous improvement, right? They're expected to show sales growth and cost savings year over year. Well, why wouldn't HR say, hey, year over year we've showed that we're hiring quality employees. We're showing workforce productivity improving year over year. We're showing the turnover rate of top performers drop year over year over year. We're showing the rate of innovation. We're showing the learning and operational speed of the organization. And you could say, hey, in 2014, these were our numbers. In 2015, this is where we're at, and this is where we're heading in 2016. You're showing an impact, and we know that each one of these areas can show an impact, not just on the HR side, but translating it to the business results. Measure quality and error rates in people management was point 7. To dive a little bit deeper into that, hey, what about a Six Sigma version of quality in the areas of hiring, retention, training, and even performance management? Conduct a failure analysis. I know in HR and talent we hate to talk about the failure side of things, but hey, we know that sometimes program or process failure occurs, right? So let's talk a little bit about and let's get some reports and results to them about failure analysis. Some data suggests that hiring has as much as a 46% failure rate. Well, that error rate that is that high should be measured and reported. And then it should be looked at as what can we do to improve this failure rate of basically employees and employee turnover. The last one we're going to highlight is calculating the ROI. Hey, almost every department and program is expected to produce a positive return on investment. But in those rare cases when talent leaders do attempt to calculate ROI, they usually just focus on the cost side. They completely ignore that other side of the equation that covers the business impacts and the investment in your talent. When operated correctly, HR should actually have a higher return on investment than the finance guys, than the operations people, and even the production folks. HR should have a higher return on investment than any other department out there. So when operated correctly and when shown and reported, you can show that you have the highest return on investment of any department in the organization. Last person we're going to talk about today was an article or a blog post that Jeff Charles, who's a pretty well-known blogger, he talked about, can you speak my language? The importance of business acumen in HR from an executive. Basically what he looked at here was that, hey, HR has some challenges. Companies' employees are its greatest asset. We all know that, right? But you're hard-pressed to find this on a balance sheet. Executives, they rely heavily on our human resource managers to keep these assets working at their highest capacity. Well, it's a challenge for you guys to do that. The balancing act between companies' interests and keeping workers happy is definitely a challenge that you face. Human resource managers have to deal with the human side of the business, which is often exceptionally challenging, can be ugly, and very rarely unrecognized. Well, are these challenges difficult to overcome? Well, you as HR managers know that executives and HR managers sometimes speak different languages. So it's difficult to overcome these. If you're talking about people and they're talking about numbers, those are two very different languages. HR managers often talk specifically about development or compliance or competencies, other legal and talent requirements. Business people are talking about metrics, business metrics. We've shared some great ways that you can translate engagement and development and competencies into business metrics. So how can you overcome this problem? Well, speak the language of business acumen. Terms that drive strategy, terms that drive economic outcomes. We've talked about a few of them, but other things like debt to equity, discounted cash flows, turnover, DuPont model. How many of us know what the DuPont model chain is? EBITDA or EBIT or some of the other measures that are out there, operating income. Speak their language. And these are terms that you can learn and you can understand. They're not as difficult as they may seem. Sometimes when we think about finance, things look much more difficult than they truly are, but they're really all just ratios. And we all learned division when we were young and in grade school. They all have a numerator, they all have a denominator. It's just basically adjusting one or the other, and the key for HR is knowing what levers to pull to increase that numerator or decrease that denominator. How can HR learn, human resources and L&D learn the business acumen of language? Well, you can get business acumen from webinars. We're not sharing a lot of business acumen today, but we've toyed around with doing some webinars on business acumen. Unfortunately, sometimes sitting through a business acumen webinar, well, how exciting is that going to be if I said return on sales is your net income, and I start running through all of this information? It could get quite boring, right? It can get old quickly. You could read a book, but I'd much rather read a good mystery than I would rather read a book about business and business acumen. Or worse, a PowerPoint. We've all sat through some of these business financial-based PowerPoints. Well, will these work? They may. You may pick up a few things that could be helpful, but the key with a lot of the traditional business acumen learning is, will you know how to apply it? And basically what Jeff was saying was that, hey, most generic lessons are just too darn abstract, theoretical. Human resource managers need to take the time and maybe even spend the money on immersive business acumen training that is hands-on, not merely theory-based. You should always make sure any training that you do to build your business acumen should be relevant to a company's specific culture or industry. Generic business acumen training can be fun, but hey, it's not very applicable if you don't understand how to make it relevant to your organization. So any training that you might undertake, make sure that you're understanding as you go through it how it's relevant to what your organization does. So some types of training that Jeff suggests, well, things that you should look at training-wise would be finance, innovation, leadership, understanding marketing, product development strategy. Participants of the training program should understand the impact of one department's decisions that they have on another. That's that cross-functional collaboration, right? Jeff says that if you don't know how this department affects that department, well, you really don't have that business acumen yet. Jeff suggests using modern training tools such as, hey, business simulations. Sorry, cheap plug. We're a simulation company, but it was in the article and it really fit in well with learning business acumen. Most effective when, and we know this from actually, doing these, that when HR managers can go through this training together as a group, it's really most effective because you can share with other HR leaders, other HR professionals, other L&D professionals, experiences and how this might apply. We've worked at Capsim with HR managers that are from the same company, and they've been able to share and actually solve some problems while going through this and talk about how this would be applicable to their organization. We've also done programs where we've had a mixed group of HR professionals from a variety of organizations, and they share what they do at their organization and how they might use this when they go back. One more cheap plug. We do business acumen workshops here at Capsim. Our next one is scheduled for January 18th and 19th. It's a 2-day workshop. You'll get 15 HRCI credits to go through this workshop. You'll experience it. Just like Jeff said in his article, it's a business simulation. It's a realistic environment. We're going to talk about how this environment is relevant to what you do on a daily basis. You're going to work with a team of other HR professionals, and you're going to make decisions in all these functional areas. And we highlight some key topics during this program of HR's role in organization strategy, learning how to convert key HR performance metrics into business metrics. So some of the stuff that we talked about today, you'll actually live it and practice doing it. Calculating human resources ROI. You'll get some definite business acumen out of a program like this, and obviously some strategic business decision making. Are we the only company that does this? Heck no. There's other companies that do business acumen training. So if you're not in Chicago on January 18th and 19th, I encourage you to become a true HR partner or business player. Find some sort of business acumen training out there, whether it's Capsim or whether it's with someone else, but make sure it follows those guidelines that we talked about. We're wrapping up our time today. That's about all I have for you sharing-wise. Any questions out there from anyone that we might have? I'm going to stay on the line for a couple minutes, but I'm going to pop up another slide. If you want to hear more, or if you'd like some more information, please contact Kirsten DeBrouwer. Kirsten is our learning program consultant. She walks our clients through basically the very beginning of understanding what we do here at Capsim, all the way through to the process of bringing me in to design and develop a program that meets your objectives. Finally, all the way through to even delivery. Kirsten will go on site when we're there and as part of the delivery process to make sure everything's going smoothly for you. You can reach her via email or you can reach her by phone. I'd like to thank all of you for spending the time with us this afternoon. Feel free to reach out to us. We're heading to another conference next week. We're going to be at the Elliott Massey Conference in beautiful Orlando, Florida. I'm very excited to go down there. And we'll actually be talking about leadership awareness down there. and some of our beliefs and experiences on leadership awareness. We're speaking Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. if any of you happen to be attending the Elliott Massey Learning 2016 conference. So maybe we'll see you at a conference, maybe we'll see you at an event, maybe we'll see you at a program, but one day hopefully we get a chance to meet you personally. Thanks again for taking the time with us today.